environment, the position I'm coming from is that it is really too late to do something about environmental catastrophe. So 20 years ago or so, or even when Hansen won Congress in '89, we might have had time to do something to avert catastrophe. But now things are so far advanced that I think we will have life at the end of the century will be completely different than the life which we have now. And people are saying that instead of 6 billion people, we may end up with 1 billion people or something like that. And I don't want to think about it, how that shrinkage from 6 to 1 happens. It's going to be not pretty. And so I'm telling my students, I'll be dead by then, although things are accelerating so much that I may still get some of the really unpleasant stuff. Yeah. I expect things to become really different in the year when the polar ice cap has completely melted. I think that, as long as there's a little ice in there, it keeps the polar ocean warmer, and once it's melted and it heats up, then everything is going to change. And so, and when is it going to be? In 10 years or so. And so what do you do in a situation like this? And my thing is, what's going to happen is that we will have, it's difficult to predict how the catastrophe will evolve and what actually will happen, but it's clear that something big will happen and things will be completely different afterwards. And then we will end up maybe in the Middle Ages, maybe in the Stone Age, I don't know, and then over the centuries, humanity will have to pull themselves up again on their knees and kind of slowly some of the areas which were so scorched that nobody could live on them would become habitable again and stuff like that. And so I don't think humanity will completely die out because people are just too resourceful. They will survive, but very small numbers, and then they will have to develop again. And I hope that the lesson which humanity will draw from this experience is that the way which we did with capitalism and with incentivizing production and letting the market take over and having a social system which we don't really control is a dead end, and that people will take a different road the second time around, and we'll have, maybe in 1,000 years or so, we will have a nicer social environment. And so when I'm working now in order to do something about the environment, like coming to this conference here, it is, first of all, I'm doing it because it's lots of fun. It's amazing, you meet the most wonderful people in that movement. And so when someone said, why don't you just party? I'm saying, I am partying. And the second thing is that I hope that what we can achieve now will have implications for many generations after us. So I think how the collapse is going to happen, whether the collapse will really be a war of all against all, where everyone is standing around their fortified compounds with machine guns, gunning down everyone else, or cannibalism and stuff like that. Whether it will be something like this, or whether it will be some more humane thing where people make the hard decisions together will make a huge difference. And so my criterion for what's happening is that if capitalism or the capitalist mentality maintains itself through the collapse, then we have lost.
Wouldn't it be cool if that collapse happened next November? That would be just perfect.
Okay, that's...
Yeah, and that I think that a lot of what you said is certainly objectively true. I mean, as far as we are now at a point where we can't talk about preventing ecological catastrophe. That one of my former colleagues, who's a hydrologist studying the effects of glacier melt, saying with global warming especially, he just said we're just all along for the ride. And so we don't have to wait for the future to start to see these effects. So I recently moved from Juneau, Alaska back to Utah. There, the glaciers are melting so fast, it's somewhat of an anomaly, it's what is called isostatic rebound, is that the earth is lifting up, and so that the earth is lifting up faster than the seawater's rising, so people are actually gaining land. My house was probably less than a mile from a glacier, and right when the house was under contract, an ice dam broke on the glacier, massive flooding. And now, it didn't flood our house, but very close to it, and the deal went through. But one of the things I thought was interesting was that, according to all the data, our house was not in a floodplain. Well, of course, that assumes a stable climate. that of course these glaciers are just rapidly melting, and already in the Arctic, we're already seeing these effects. That it's certainly within the realm of possibilities that at least within Alaska, maybe they'll survive in some parts of the world, but the polar bears will be absolutely extinct due to, but many other species. And so I certainly agree that we've really passed the point of preventing massive ecological damage, and that we're certainly going to have to alter the way we change. I guess my hope, though, well, in answer to can the world survive capitalism, absolutely not. That there has to be something to replace it, which is socially just, ecologically sustainable, but then also, I would say, has to take into account other species on the planet. My own background, I'm an environmental sociologist, but I would say if we look at capitalism, I would say both as an economic system, but also as a culture, it is not ecologically sustainable. And so, one of the more obvious things if we look at capitalist economics is that it depends on ever-increasing levels of production and consumption. And that's physically impossible to have perpetual growth. Quoting Edward Abbey, hopefully many of you have read Abbey, saying perpetual growth is the ideology of the cancer cell. It's just not a possible thing. And then it's also important to understand, and Marx talked about this, is that capitalism constrains the freedom not only of workers but of capitalists themselves, of government officials. I mean, if we look at contemporary corporation, they have to perpetually expand. They have to convince their shareholders that they're going to make an investment, they're going to get more out of that than what they put into it. I mean, that the whole system of investments and profits really depend on one another. So imagine, the CEO of General Motors just saying, we're ruining the planet, therefore we're going to try to sell fewer cars next year and fewer the next year. I mean, of course, people would sell their shares, the shareholders would sue, this person would be out of business very quickly. And so the corporations have to think toward the next business quarter, that short-term profit, expansion. One of the interesting things I read recently, I mean, if we look at as far as building these massive vehicles, is that the average fuel efficiency of vehicles in the 21st century is lower than that of the Model T Ford, right? Because if you look at a Model T Ford, relatively small vehicle, these massive things, they have to put them out, they have to increase. But then if we look to what many individuals will say, well, but the government can regulate it. Well, no, the government can't regulate it. I mean, if we look at the Democrats or the Republicans, both embracing, obviously, capitalist economics, they just have different versions. They're both parties of perpetual growth. And so Republicans are embracing supply side or trickle-down theory economics. So let's cut taxes on the wealthy and corporations, and the economy will grow. And then if we look at what Obama's doing now, or at least trying to do, is Keynesian economics. The idea, government spending, great jobs, but the ultimate goal of both of these are to have economic growth. Now, suppose Obama's successful. One of the best things for the environment has actually been this recession. Well, I mean, if you look at like when Al Gore was vice president, the carbon footprint of the United States increased exponentially, right? Because the economy was doing well. That economic growth is basically biocidal. So if either the Republicans or the Democrats are successful in getting the economy going, promoting economic growth, that will just worsen the ecological crisis and ultimately, obviously, the economic crisis, because it's just simply not sustainable. So the idea that the government can step in and regulate and stop this, I think is just wishful thinking. And of course, what another thing would be, well, we'll just get more efficient. Technology is going to save us. The short answer to that is that in a society that doesn't depend on perpetual growth, which focuses on use values of products rather than their exchange value, efficiency is a good thing. Right? It saves people labor, can reduce ecological impacts. And capitalism, in many cases, energy efficiency just actually increases ecological degradation. And I know that's not intuitive, but if you think about, and this comes from John Bellamy Foster, who's actually relying on a 19th century British economist, Jevons, called the Jevons paradox, is that when a business invests in energy efficient technology, that increases profits, and of course profits are reinvested into a business, so it causes expansion. Now what Jevons maintained was that the steam engine in the 19th century, which used the least amount of energy, was the least efficient one because they hardly used it because it burned so much coal. And so if you look at when a commodity, particularly something like energy, becomes less expensive, that leads to rapid economic expansion where you have actually more ecological degradation. Very interesting thing, and so I think it would make a good doctoral dissertation for someone. I had an experience several years ago where Juneau's electricity is generated by hydroelectric power, and so 10 cents a kilowatt hour. So relatively cheap electricity. An avalanche came along and wiped out the power lines from the generator. So for 3 months, it was diesel generation, so a 500% increase in the cost of electricity. Well, at the aggregate level, there was a 40% decrease in the use of electricity, so of residences and businesses. Once the electricity went back online, it actually that all these efficient people invested in all, compact fluorescent light bulbs, etc. Is that it actually, electricity became cheap again, and it went back to higher levels of production and consumption of energy. And that was even despite a slight decrease in population, right? So that you get these commodities, not just businesses, but individuals tend to use more. And so technology doesn't really save things. And one of the things you think about with efficiency is marketing. And so that we could say that many appliances, et cetera, are much more energy efficient than they were, say, 30 years ago, 50 years ago, but we have more of them. And so that's one of the things about capitalism, is to produce artificial desires, artificial wants. They become needs. And so if you compare the average home in the 1950s to the present days, many homes didn't have things like televisions or telephones. And of course now, if you look at most homes, you can convince people to own, every person in the house needs their own personal television. They need their own personal toilet. They need their own telephone. Maybe some people own multiple phones, multiple vehicles. Every person who has a license must have at least one vehicle. Right? So it doesn't matter even if these things are more efficient, or even like think about houses being maybe more energy efficient, but they're much larger, and so that the aggregate level of energy used. And this is caused by marketing. Now, if we look at culture, I think one of the myths about Utah is that the dominant culture is Mormonism. The dominant culture of Utah is capitalism, and the dominant culture of Massachusetts is capitalism. But the basic belief of capitalism, of capitalist culture, is certainly that ever-increasing standard of living is both desirable and possible. How do we measure our progress as individuals? By how many commodities we can consume, or we're able to consume. But also, it turns us into individuals who are isolated from one another. And so that you were talking about, well, making this kind of connection with future generations, hoping they're going to do better. Capitalism, we're not even, the future generations, for all intents and purposes, they're just off, they're not even on the radar. But other individuals, maybe just your immediate family, something like that, but the isolated individuals, is that the belief is that each individual pursuing their own interests results in the common good. And this is, I mean, you talk about a radically new philosophy in the history of humanity. That's certainly contrary to anything that came before it, any sense of community, any sense of self-sacrifice for the common good. No, the capitalist culture teaches that self-indulgence is good, that not caring about other individuals is good. I think Kurt Vonnegut captured it well in his novel, God Bless You, Mr. Rosewater, where he said, on some of our currency, it's printed e pluribus unum, so out of many, one. He said that should be replaced with, screw you, Jack, I've got mine. Right? And that is not an ethic that allows people to survive over the long term. That's all I have to say.
Thank you. Perhaps I'll move over. It seems like I'm part of the panel. There's plenty of room here. And for those of you that did join us late, this is Hans Ehrbar, pronounced it correctly?
Yes.
Of the University of Utah's Economics Department, and Alex Simon, who is on our behavioral science faculty as a sociologist. And I as well am a sociologist in behavioral science. I've had my comments somewhat written down because I will talk forever if I don't do that. We'll see how all these new glasses work.
You had reading glasses last time I saw you.
I just got them, and I don't think I can use them. They worked all right this morning. But the despair that I heard Dr. Ehrbar suggesting really is there when you stop and think about things rationally. But another point was that, even if the future doesn't look real rosy, we still don't want to give up the struggle, don't want to just allow despair to take over, because that's just, you have to go down fighting at the very least. Some of the things that I wanted to refer to are more on the immediate level, and I still have hope, even if it's not a rational hope, that we can do something. We can reverse the trends that are destroying our planet, as it were. But what it's going to require is, like Dr. Simon Alex was saying, is that it's going to make a difference in culture. It's going to mean a whole different way of thinking. So that's probably what I wanted to address. The creation of wealth or capital extends from the exploitation of labor, but I also want to include that natural resources also must be exploited. So just as our cultural values and social institutions define work and workers in ways that legitimates their exploitation through wage labor, the environment must also be defined in ways that allow its exploitation. So first of all, just as an introduction to my discussion, I wanted to begin by questioning this idea that we're talking about the environment to begin with. I don't like to use the term the environment because I really would argue we ought to be using the term our environment. By calling it the environment, I'm really going to have to stick to my my words because I feel myself wanting to go off. So by referring to the natural environment in which we live and on which we depend as the environment, it takes on an identity of its own. It's a separate entity that takes on a set of interests and an identity that allows it to be thought of as just another interest group to be added to this equation of cost-benefit analysis. So business has to compromise something, and then the environment has to compromise something to balance the demands of the economy and the environment. We hear those types of arguments all the time. If it were defined as our environment, it would be unthinkable to compromise the natural elements on which our very lives all depend. If our environment were thought of as like a fish tank in which we all swim, we would not be willing to alter the pH, to raise the salinity, to alter the temperature, to change the aeration, or to allow algae growth or other filth to develop in our tank. So we are the fish that will be floating on the surface if we don't really think about how altering our environment is going to affect us as people. But yet we don't see the fish tank. We are floating around, many of us already are belly up in our dirty fish tank without accepting that this is going on. So we've defined the environment as separate from ourselves. That was a crucial point of capitalist development. So the environment is seen as wild nature out there, while we humans exist in a separate world of civilization. So our landscape photos, our landscape paintings, all have to, exclude human beings. We want to see natural portraits that don't include any people, just mountains and forests and oceans and things that are untouched by humankind. We pack our picnic lunches and visit nature. We go backpacking or camping and we spend some time in nature, but after a couple days we come back to our nice civilized little lives as though they are these two separate entities. So separating ourselves from nature, which is impossible in reality, we're part of nature, nature's part of us. We cannot conceive of nature and civilization, or rather we do conceive of it as separate, but we shouldn't do that. My point, I don't want to argue that we ought to continue this, but this justifies the degrading of natural resources for monetary gain. We can see nature as something to destroy, something to conquer, something to use, because we define it as something separate from ourselves. So can the world survive? And I actually don't think that there's a problem with the Earth surviving. I know we've mentioned this before, that the Earth will continue to go on just fine, but we humans will not. And all the other living things potentially may not as well. So almost all people will develop cancer in their lifetimes now. This is just a fact. We are spending billions of dollars to find a cure for cancer, but at the same time, we don't stop giving ourselves cancer. We see an explosion of developmental disabilities. We see allergies, asthma, autoimmune diseases, juvenile diabetes, heart disease. All these things are taking place at an earlier and earlier age. This is a time in which for the first time in recent history, the next generation will live a shorter life than their parents. We have obesity and malnourishment in the same population, typically in the same person. When autoimmune diseases, autism, neurological disorders are becoming the new normal, we really have to stop and reflect, although we still don't pay much attention to that. Millions of men can no longer reproduce. When a population can no longer reproduce, can physically procreate, that's a real sign that there's something wrong in the health of the population. Our diets and the chemical additives in our environment have made a huge number of men, millions and millions of men, unable to mate. They can no longer get an erection. If nothing else brings it to our attention, the dying children, the growing rate of birth defects, you would think that, in spite of all these chronic diseases and things that are right before our eyes, at least the inability of men to have sex would wake us up. But it doesn't seem like it's making much difference because we have Viagra. You can take a pill, and somehow we don't have to deal with the causes for the inability of millions of American men unable to have sex any longer. So we talk about this melting ice, the changing weather patterns, all these big issues. I wanted to bring things down close to home. Capitalism seeks to exploit nature, so it is defined as separate from the people. So we can conquer it, we can defeat nature for our own gain, or at least the gain of the investors in the business. owners. The defeat of nature is advertised as a benefit for all of us. It makes our lives easier, it makes it more plentiful. The abundance of all the things on which we really see our living conditions rising, at least so we're told. But the sickness is ignored in our society. If you think about how our food system is working, our nature requires the natural decomposition of living matter in order to replenish nutrients in the soil. Those nutrients are absorbed into the organisms that we eat. That's what nutrition is. So scientists who are funded by industry discovered more efficient ways to fertilize the soil through chemical inputs, mostly anhydrous ammonia, but many others, and mechanization. So the ammonia, which is very, very high in nitrogen, allows for abundant yields. The plants grow very well, but it kills all the nutrients in the soil. There are no vitamins, no nutrition in the food that we're eating. In our food, despite it looking beautiful, picture perfect. So this weakens our immune system, and we cannot fight off diseases to remain healthy. We could talk about other parts of separating nature, especially if we even simply think about the food we eat. The industrial agriculture is also break down the composition of the soil, which has allowed most of the soil that existed following World War II to now be eroded and gone at the bottom of the Gulf of Mexico. So that's just a completely other story. Can we survive this separation of nature and humanity just on the other elements? But we are not paying much attention to the need for us to pay attention to the natural processes. So I'll try to wrap things up. Industries profit from the chemical and mechanical inputs to our food system and other industries, sometimes owned by the same conglomerates. So profit comes from also treating the sicknesses that is caused by this undermining of our natural environment to begin with. We still see people living into old age, but they were brought up before the 1970s when we started to really degrade our food, our nutrition systems. As time moves forward, the average life expectancy will go down. The young generations now won't live as long as their parents. And while they are alive, they have higher rates of disease and chronic illness than ever before. The idea that we can conquer nature is coming around to bite us in the butt in so many ways. The overuse of antibiotics will allow pandemic outbreaks. The alteration of the chemistry of living systems is undermining the ability of organisms to survive and reproduce. We could go on and on. I think I'll cut out this next section because it was really depressing to begin with. So in the end, we're all really guinea pigs, if you will, or petri dish experiments in some giant industry's laboratory that they want to profit from the artificial inputs to the natural ecosystems and then to profit from the management of the destruction caused by that environmental degradation. So as long as we allow the capitalists to define nature as separate from ourselves, we'll continue to suffer from these unnatural causes. That's something that I wanted to suggest, that we have to think about the environment in a very new way, actually as our environment, in order to even begin to start thinking about ways that we can make our lives better. And why do we kill ourselves, quite literally, and not even pay attention? And we continue to follow the same path. Anyway, please let me defer now to the other colleagues up here. Ideas from y'all? We have a small enough group to have a discussion, a nice dialogue.
One thing I guess I would say, but does anybody else want to speak up? I certainly agree that the way, Western society, certainly capitalism, has defined the environment as external to us, and I do think that's a negative thing. That we're separate from. So the environment is right here. We're in it. Humans are certainly part of the environment. I think I would disagree in defining it as our environment, though. So going back to Marx said that no one owns the environment. So saying that not present generations, not even the collective future generations own the environment. He saw it as belonging to humanity in general in perpetuity, and I would partially agree with that, but I think it also needs to be redefined as we're just one of many species on the planet, and like all species, we're going to eventually go extinct, and we've only been here really for a short time. That I think has to be conceived of more from an ecocentric point of view, is that we're just one species among many, and that I would operate from the premise that other species perhaps don't have the right as individuals not to die. I mean, we need to kill things, be it plants or other animals, to survive. We need to appropriate. We're part of the environment, but we do need to appropriate from the environment. I mean, basic biology, a certain degree of killing is necessary for life on Earth. But we need to consider not only present-day humanity, future humanity, and not look at it as, well, this is our planet, we may do with it what we wish, but also the well-being of other species. And of course, that's even, it could be seen in terms of enlightened self-interest, is that ecological diversity is certainly in the long-term interest of humanity as well.
Maybe one thought when you said our environment is being killed and we don't even pay attention to it. And I think as a Marxist I see a parallel between the lack of consciousness of the population that this is our environment. It's parallel to the lack of consciousness of our population that what's wrong in capitalism is that the producers are separated from the means of production, and we should, just as people that thought that we should have control over our means of production is so thoroughly driven out of us that the thought that we should have control over our environment doesn't even come up anymore. So there is a parallel, so capitalist exploitation prepared us for the ultimate exploitation and suicide which is going on right now.
That's a more formal way of explaining the point I was trying to make. These, the lack of awareness that we are, directly affected by these environmental circumstances, really is part of a false consciousness, but I do see that as produced by an outside force. It's a cultural value that's been created in order to enhance what Alex was suggesting, the marketing of consumption. To not pay attention to these things is really important.
Well, and I think one of the unfortunate things is the higher your socioeconomic status, the more you can externalize the costs of production and escape, at least temporarily, the effects. So you think locally, the air quality is horrible, but you could just buy a mountain retreat to get above the inversions. Or Lauren Summers seems to be the darling of Democratic presidents, but so both Clinton and Obama, and of course many of you know he was at Harvard, ran into some difficulties, but this idea, of the environment being a separate entity and suggesting, well, it's a good idea to put polluting industries into the third world because these peasants don't really buy that much anyhow, so we might as well poison them. It's kind of like this idea of you just scoop up, whatever from your own yard and throw it over the fence and it's gone. And of course, the higher your social class, I mean, you can get sushi in the desert here. I mean, that you just pretend that there's no scarcity in the oceans, that sort of thing. And so, unfortunately, the higher people's social class, the more oblivious they are to these sort of things. And of course, the higher the social class, the more power you have to affect change.
Maybe we can get some input from the audience. Yeah. Maybe we should just go around and everybody introduce themselves.
Yeah, that'd be good. Good idea.
Please.
Yeah, sure. I'm Max, I'm a student here. I'm also a member of the Revolutionary Students Union. And Gregory sends his apologies that he's running late. He ran into some unforeseen circumstances this morning. I was just wondering what some of your thoughts are on the success of socialist experiments like Cuba, for example, meeting sustainability requirements that the first world is not even near. Do you think that's just a necessary part of a socialist program, or is it something that's unique to Cuba or that kind of area of the world?
Is your question, is socialism inherently ecologically sustainable? Is that what you're asking? Or?
No, not so much, because that wouldn't be properly materialist, I think. But
okay.
I'm just, what are your views on Cuba and its success in ecological sustainability?
I could speak to that.
Please, anybody. I don't mind asking anybody. Yes.
I don't want to step on your toes
Yeah.
either.
Yeah.
But But what happened in Cuba was that, because of the United States embargo, they were unable to, of course, import manufactured goods, parts of the industrial agriculture, and once the Soviet Union collapsed, they had no real source of new industrial agricultural products, the tractors that they needed, the new petrochemicals that are needed for fertilizers, etc. So they had an incredibly well-orchestrated attempt to try to remember how to use 19th century technologies. Those before the Green Revolution, if you will, before World War II, that really industrialized agriculture. And it's been an incredible success story just to, number one, find people that were still old enough to remember how to plow a field with animal power rather than mechanization. And it has really been a success story, but I'm not really very optimistic that it would have been undertaken under any other circumstances without being
without
forced.
the embargo, okay.
So yeah, I think we have been taught that science and new technology is always going to be superior. And going backward in time, I think a lot of us would think of that as an unfortunate circumstance. You took a step back in technology to do things the way they were doing things back in the 14th, 15th, 16th, 17th centuries, but yet they worked, they were sustainable. And those are things that I think we need to learn from it. Unfortunately, they are remembering how it's done so that maybe when we need it, we can ask them. But I can defer as well.
Yeah, I think much what went wrong with socialism, say after World War II period, was the race with the capitalist consumerism. There were two races going on. On the one hand, the socialist countries saw all the cars and all the prosperity in capitalism, which came from cheap energy, and they tried to emulate it. And they were often tenuous regimes who had to kind of buy off the population. So they, one of the things the Soviet Union did, and which I think was wrong, is they gave them the oil even cheaper than the world market. Even after OPEC in 1973, the Soviet Union was still delivering incredibly cheap oil to Poland and stuff. And the Polish area in Silesia or pretty much anywhere there, became environmental wastelands because they used so much coal and pollution, and there was no guard against pollution, just in order to keep up with producing enough consumption goods so that they could keep up with the rest. And that is in my way of thinking, a perversion of socialism.
Right.
One of the things they did wrong is they tried to selectively copy elements of capitalism which they thought were good, and they pretty much did everything wrong this way. They should have started completely fresh with a completely new philosophy how to live and what a good life is. But they couldn't do this because there was this huge temptation and pressure, and everything seemed to be so wonderful. And the Hollywood film said, "Oh, live in America, and you're going to live like God." And so
they had the same notions of capitalist progress, more production, more consumption. But I mean, I don't know that much about environmental policy in Cuba. That I am aware that they've done a lot better job than certainly most Latin American countries, and things like forest preservation. That has been voluntary, and that has been basically inciting the need for ecological diversity. I think that with a society like Cuba, once you switch over from looking at producing things, for their exchange value into their use value, I mean, Cuba's certainly done a much better job at figuring out, well, how do we deliver healthcare to everyone? And in many cases, much more successfully than the United States. How do we feed everyone? That sort of thing. So, I mean, depending on the social class you're born into, you would probably be in some cases much better off being born Cuban than being born into the United States. I mean, particularly in some of our inner city urban areas. But I mean, I think we're all in agreement that certainly the Soviet Union was both a social and an ecological nightmare. So that socialism is not necessarily going to lead the way either, just by nature of being socialism, that it has to have a green element to it.
I apologize, I have to leave for another class.
Okay.
So I'm sure you're in capable hands. Good day, Al. Nice to meet you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Al, thank you for having me.
I just have a comment. I hear you saying that there needs to be a huge cultural shift from capitalism to either socialism or Marxism, but how do you, with an environmental, with a green aspect to that, but how do we as individuals, just sitting here in Orem, start that shift happening? I know what I can do personally and what I am doing personally in my own backyard, my own space, but now I'm freaked out because, I buy fluorescent light bulbs and, energy efficient appliances, and I think, dang, because there's a negative aspect to that, the overproduction of
Right.
energy efficient appliances. So at this point, I think, and it is disheartening. And I think, is it really going to come to annihilation before people are jolted enough to do something differently, or like the Cubans, have an external force come, an embargo before we actually move? I don't know, capitalism is just so embedded and so powerful. What do you do?
See, one of the things which we haven't discussed here yet, it's not only a social force which keeps us paralyzed. It is kind of the unholy alliance between social class interests and our own psychological defenses. So it's they both come together to make it impossible for people to think that this is reality. And I know many things I'm doing myself. One of the things, for instance, all my passwords, and nowadays you need so many passwords. They all have to do with global warming or dust bowl or tornadoes. So every day when I type those things in, I remember again, oh yes, those things are coming. And even if everything is nice and wonderful outside, this is an illusion. It is we are living in a emergency situation which does not look like an emergency situation. Right? If there would be lightning flashing on the sky and stuff like that, then people would maybe realize that something is happening. But all you hear is on specific websites about, polar ice just reached a global minimum again, surpassing even the minimum in 2007 or so, which was catastrophic, and now we are below that. So these are the lightning flashes, but they are not visible to the normal person. Everyone acts as if it was not happening, and everyone who is talking about we have to get the economy grow again is ignoring all those things.
Right.
And so what do you do? So I'm kind of pinching myself. I don't own a car. I sit on the bus stop and wait for the bus, and the bus doesn't come. And while I'm waiting for the bus, one SUV after another cruises by with one person in there, and I see all this insanity, what's going on. And another thing is I just one trick how to make this real for myself, because that's really important. That I need to be completely convinced that it's a reality. Otherwise, I'm not able to make the rational responses to it. And one thing is just start acting as if it was real. and that makes a difference too. So for instance, I made an investment which in terms of an investment is a very bad investment, namely I bought some land adjacent to where I live and I'm renting this out to an organic farmer so that I have food available. And this is, in terms of monetary investment, it's a bad investment, but in terms of just telling myself, yes, that is the kind of things we need to do, it kind of grounds me more in reality.
My name is Charles Knuckles. I chair the Department of Anthropology at Brigham Young University, and I'm delighted to be present in this conference, and I hope through it we might establish linkages between UVU and BYU, because I assure you there are many people at my institution who are thinking along similar lines. One plug I want to make is that in terms of collapse theory in anthropology, there's a lot of it. The three people I read most in that regard are all appearing in the state of Utah within the next couple of weeks. One is Norman Yaffe, an archaeologist at the University of Michigan, who will be giving the Shallot Lecture at BYU on Thursday at 3 p.m. He will be talking to a large audience on the nature of collapse and how it can be assessed archaeologically. The second talk is next week in Salt Lake City. That's Richard Heinberg, who will be talking about the end of growth. That's the title of his most recent book, and he's well known in peak oil circles as the author of The Party's Over and Peak Everything and a few other things. The third talk will be coming up on October 7th. That is Joseph Tainter, who wrote the classic text published by Cambridge called The Collapse of Complex Societies. Joe Tainter is the chair of economy at the Department of Economy and Society at USU at the moment, and he'll be coming down to BYU to speak on October 7th. You all are, of course, more than welcome to come to the BYU events. I will be traveling up to Salt Lake City by car to attend the two talks by Richard Heinberg, and I'm more than happy to carpool with any of you. But please do, let's establish linkages between where you are and BYU, because we do, in fact, on this have a lot in common.
One of the things as far as making transition, with capitalist culture, I do think there's a lot of evidence that it's really just built on so the whole thing of that increasing standard of living leads to greater happiness. The whole thing is just really built on a weak foundation, which I think could pretty seriously implode. I mean, now short term, there's not a lot of reason for optimism. I mean, I was at this institution years ago. I did some research around 2003, and like the average student wanted these huge salaries. They expected to get them. They wanted about half of them wanted a home, not just one home, but a second home for recreation and these huge vehicles and all of this sort of thing. But the evidence to support, beyond a certain level, right? People need food, clothing, shelter, healthcare. Beyond a certain level that it actually increases happiness is really not there. So if we're talking about Cuba, the Cubans are some of the happiest people on the planet. That if we look at ourselves versus the 1950s, per capita consumption has nearly doubled since then. The number of people reporting to be happy, about a third, is flat, right? That this idea, if you think about if you think about things which preceded capitalism, so different religious philosophies, etc. None of them tell you that getting more material resources is the path to happiness. And I think that I do see, glimmers of hope in like the economist Juliet Shore, or Society for a New American Dream, getting people to reject consumerism. So you might have heard of like voluntary simplicity. And so what does the market offer us for the economic crisis? Go out and buy something, right? So go out and buy, your Nissan Leaf, and so I saw this commercial where this polar bear will come down and hug you, right? Maybe a better solution is to buy. You've maybe heard of Buy Nothing Day. Maybe walk to work, right? Maybe don't buy something, right? And maybe exchange, these hours people are working. What Shore talks about is to develop genuine relationships.
A friend of mine who works on this campus, Grant Richards, he's a psychologist, but he's also a Mormon bishop. What I thought was really interesting is that as a Mormon, he really embraced this idea of voluntary simplicity. And part of Buy Nothing Day, you can give people certificates for Christmas where you say, hey, let's not give each other gifts. Let's spend time with each other. And he said some people thought it was great, but some people were genuinely angry with him. How dare you, say you're not going to buy me something or not let me buy you something, So what I think is interesting, what's been talked about is the Freudian idea of a fetish. So people having sex with a shoe rather than a human is this idea that you substitute an object for a healthy adult relationship. Well, this is what we've done. It doesn't have to be sexual, but rather than spend time with your kids, you buy them all kinds of lavish gifts, and there's actually a positive correlation, or actually a negative correlation. Is the less time parents spend with their kids, the more things they spend to compensate for that. So I think holding out the promise of genuine human relationships, and rather than having our television tell us what we want, figuring out what we want on our own, I think holds some promise at least.
Fortunately, what we've seen is the opposite since the 1960s. You all are probably familiar with Robert Putnam's book, Bowling Alone.
Right.
That paradigm shows that voluntary associations, which were prolific in this country until about the 1960s, have fallen off a cliff.
The erosion of community. Yeah.
And so I think you're absolutely right. Restoring a sense of human belonging may be our first and most urgent task.
Right.
But how to do that? Certainly Hans and his community have pioneered one approach, and that is the approach of co-housing.
Yeah.
And I think that's extremely valid, of course.
I know what Shore is doing. This isn't it's called simplicity circles, where people actually get together. It's actually like support groups. How do we downshift our lifestyles? Part of that is building community around that and redefining and figuring out what you can get rid and what you can get rid of. But you're that absolutely what Putnam's talking about is that we become these isolated individuals sitting at home shopping in the internet or television telling us we must go out and get these things. And of course, one of the things that Juliet Shore's talked about, our reference groups used to be, keeping up with our neighbors, keeping up with the Joneses. Now we're trying to keep up with fictitious people or on television, or somebody like Donald Trump or Paris Hilton. And they're telling us who we are and who we should aspire to be is a very scary thing. So we have to, there's certainly not an easy way for transition, but part of it I think is being aware of the problem, finding like-minded people, getting support from them, record, and I think part of it maybe stepping in, so I assume you'd be ostracized when you don't own a car, or I get ostracism, my truck just turned 21 years old, but it still runs, so I keep driving it. Those things, I think refusing to drive a car, that we should hold people up like that. What Herman Daly, brother of the economist Herman Daly, said, if you go back and you look at prior to Christianity, monks who took a vow of poverty were held in higher regard than wealthy merchants, and we've just inverted that. And so we've got to get back to the people who put service to community and self-sacrifice for the common good. We've got to elevate those sort of behaviors. It's not an easy thing to do, to cut through the noise of the media, commercialism, and all of that. But there's some solutions.
I've looked into the co-housing movement here, and it's not very accessible to all people. You have to still be of a certain social class to even be able to participate in the co-housing. So while I love that idea, it needs to be accessible to more people.
How?
I don't know.
That's the question.
There are lots of vacancies now in various co-housing communities around the country, and many of them really got hit by the collapse of the housing market. Especially those who started right before the collapse, and they expected the housing prices to go up, and now they are underwater basically with their assets. So it is even co-housing is in an interesting situation right now.
Yeah. I mean, and one of the things that Shore talks about is demanding that alternatives be made available and affordable. I mean, like one thing that we've all experienced in our lifetimes is the disappearance of public telephones. And so it becomes mandatory, many people feel, to go out and buy a phone and carry your phone around with you. Or the same thing with mass transit, or well, a recent argument I got into with President Holland, this idea, we have more students, therefore we must build more parking lots and subsidize cars. And I said, well, why don't we just actually subsidize people who walk to work and start charging for parking? Oh no, we can't do that because it's an infringement on freedom. But I mean, really, it's a shift in subsidies, what behaviors are going to subsidize. Shall we declare victory? Hope for the future?
Yes.
A few more thousand people here.
Yeah. But again, I was a little nervous at the beginning. I do appreciate people showing up.
So I need a reading list. Could somebody put together a reading list for people who need to be educated or would like to educate others? Juliet Shore.
Sure, yeah. I mean, there's tons of that. My email is alex.simon@uvu.edu that I can certainly email you some of her work.
Okay.
But there's all kinds of things that certainly. Yeah. And actually, I think she just came out with a new book, but I think one of her more recent ones came out like a couple of years ago called Born to Buy, and looks at the commercialization of childhood. Which I think is, if you have kids, I just think it's an invaluable thing to read.
Well, thank you very much.
Yeah.